Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Ivory, and you are tuned in to the Embracing Neurodiversity podcast, where I share my personal journey of embracing and enhancing the experience of my amazing son who is on the spectrum. Through this journey, I've discovered a lot about myself and continue to grow every day. My goal is to provide you with some useful insights and stories that will inspire you in your own parenting journey. Thank you for tuning in. Hey, everybody, welcome back. Thank you for tuning in per usual. I am excited to be back and I feel reinvigorated and ready to roll out more content for you all. I skipped last week because life has been lifing and sometimes you have to deprioritize things and prioritize others depending on what the demands of your life call for. And for me, last week, in my full-time job, the job that pays me to take care of myself and my son there's some deadlines and projects that I needed to meet, and so I prioritized that. So that there's that. But also it was just I just was like had a foggy brain last week. There was a lot going on, and not to mention that I never want to do a podcast episode just talking about anything or going off the cuff. I research a lot of what I talk to you all about. I'm reading about it, I'm reflecting on it. I'm very intentional about the information that I'm putting out into the world. And so if a time comes where I don't know quite what I want to focus on for the week, or I'm not sure what I want to say, then I don't force it, right? And so that was a part of it too. But I am back and I am ready to re engage. I am rolling out a series called Transformative Parenting, and it is focused on supporting parents to unpack their deeply rooted mindsets around what it means to raise a child on the spectrum. But also, I think you all probably know by now that my channel is around reflecting and impacting my experience as an autism mom. But within that, there are many threads around personal development. And so this podcast is also intended to support anyone who is interested in developing themselves to be a higher version of themselves and to understand that life happens for you and not to you, and how do we take difficult moments and allow them to transform us into better human beings, right? And so with that, today I wanted to focus on a term you probably have heard before, but maybe you have not. And that term is trauma response, right? And I was inspired to focus on that because I have been reading a book lately. It just came out last week, so I started reading it last week. Jada Pinkett Smith's book. If you're not familiar, she is a mother and actress, wife of Will Smith, and she's been in the media and pop culture a lot over the past couple of weeks, promoting her book, obviously, but then getting a lot of feedback around being an oversharer of her experience. And honestly, like a lot of blame has been placed on her around the experiences that her and Will Smith have had in their marriage, and the incident happened with Will Smith, but that's a whole nother topic for another day. I want to focus on her book, and I honestly feel like what the media and interview snippets are rolling out does not give her book justice. Her book is called Worthy. It's so much more deeper than that. And again, if you are somebody who is highly interested in personal development, then I highly recommend this book. But in reading the book, I ran across something she said around how the need to fit in, conform, and make decisions in order to fit in and conform is a trauma response, right? And so of course, it had my little neurons in my brain peaking because I that's the work that I do around unpacking why we need to conform or to fit in, right? And so, but I never heard it in the context of it being a trauma response. And so, of course, I was like, oh, I want to dive into that a little bit more. I want to read about that a little bit more. And of course, I immediately thought about my son who's on the autism spectrum and other children and people like him who are on the autism spectrum, and how oftentimes, I spoke about this in a previous podcast, as they grow in this society, they are either forced or taught to conform and to mask a lot of their autism traits, right? And so I was like, okay, if children on the spectrum are taught in a lot of ways to conform to mainstream society of being and existing in the world, and then they adapt to that, is that also a trauma response, right? And of course, y'all know me. I went to go dig and do some reading about it. So over the past couple of days, I learned some things. And so when I learn, I teach. So here I am with a few pointers and food for thought for you around how to think more critically as parents, as people, as human beings, to think more critically about how you operate in the world, and is it in alignment to who you are and how the world functions, or is it in a space of conformity in order to feel accepted, which is a trauma response, right? And to think about that a little bit more and to start unpacking that a little bit more, right? Let's dive right in. In my reading and research, I learned that a trauma response is actually your subtle day to day actions and behaviors that you believe, whether consciously or subconsciously, will keep you safe, right? And they derive from a traumatic experience in which you behave the same way in order to experience safety in that moment of experiencing that traumatic experience. And then you took that behavior and applied it to your day to day life as a response to the fear that you felt in that moment, in that during that event, right? And so to simplify it, I want to step back and define trauma. And a lot of psychologists say that it's very difficult to define trauma because trauma is really can only really be defined by the person that is experiencing it. The same event could happen to two different people, and one person may experience it as trauma and another may not. And that's based on so many different variables, our DNA, our upbringing, whatever the case may be. And trauma is not necessarily a one size fits all definition, but I hope it's helpful to realize that when we say trauma, we really are talking about, or when I say trauma, I'm speaking specifically about an event or circumstance that makes an individual feel fearful or unsafe, right? And that can run the gamut. It can be extreme trauma, or it could be something subtle, right? It's more an extreme event or behavior or dangerous experience, or something subtle, right? A microaggression. But with that, if we begin to understand our individual, how we respond to things individually, we will begin to define what is can be traumatic for us. But also we can then start to think about, how do I respond? How have I responded in the past to traumatic moments? And how do I respond on a day to day that keeps me feeling safe as a response to that traumatic event? And that essentially is what a trauma response is, right? And so to bring it back in and align it to our sense of our need for acceptance, we tend to behave in a certain way to conform. And it is simply because we've received messages, whether direct or indirect, in the society as a whole or in our immediate family structures or circles. We've received messages that in order to feel safe and feel loved, this is how you should behave. If you behave or operate outside of these parameters, then you will experience punishment, some sort of penalty, some sort of judgment, something that makes you feel less than who you deserve to feel in the world, right? And so those experiences over time, especially as children, compound, and then we begin to learn, okay, this is how I behave in order to feel love and acceptance from those around me who are important to me, but also in school settings in order to not be disciplined, in work settings in order to get promotions, in society in order to feel accepted and celebrated, right? These are the ways that I should behave. And I can unpack that because it is levels to it. But in its simplest form, because most things are tied back to race, in its simplest form, many of us have been taught that speaking a certain way or looking a certain way that is aligned to white dominant culture or mainstream society will give us a level of acceptance or safety. A clear example of that is the racial tension in our across the globe, in which people who have less than or people who are melanated experience a higher level of poverty or violence, right? Because who they are is deemed unacceptable. And so many of us who come from those experiences um, learn other ways to conform to society in order to be accepted, in order to feel safe, right? And so when we think about that in the context of raising a child on the autism spectrum and a lot of the personality traits that come with being a child on the autism spectrum, from my vantage point of observing my own child, some of those traits aren't always deemed to be acceptable in mainstream society, but it is still fundamentally a part of who that person is or who your child is. And oftentimes, because they're not operating in a space that is what is viewed as normal to others, other people become uncomfortable with that, and then they tend to project their own level of fear and judgment upon an individual who is different. And that individual feels and experiences it and then begins to feel like there's something wrong with them or they're not good enough. And so my charge as a parent and my charge as a mother of a son on the spectrum is to always ensure that my son feels comfortable with being himself, exactly who he is, regardless of how other people feel about it. Because we also know, studies show that the more we tend to conform to spaces and places that aren't meant for, that don't celebrate who we are, we depression persists. Mental health is become it impacts our mental health in a myriad of ways when we suppress who we are fundamentally in order to feel safe in the world, in order to feel accepted from others. When we do that, little by little, we are diminishing our light and who we are. And then that's when our anxiety increases, depression increases. And the goal ultimately is to live in a society where every individual can be their ultimate selves, the highest level of themselves, without having to change who they are and still feel accepted and embraced and celebrated. Not in spite of, but because of who they are exactly, right? And so going back to what it means to conform as a trauma response, I want to tie this into the idea that feeling unsafe, feeling unworthy, experiencing a lack of celebration of who you are can be traumatic too, right? In a myriad of ways as children, when perhaps you are a hyperactive child and you are constantly wanting to engage in physical activities, but it's probably too much for your parents. And so you're constantly being told, sit down, be quiet, you're doing too much. Perhaps you're the talkative child and your parent is telling you to be quiet. And even in those ways, you are receiving a message of being that who you are is not enough and you need to shift that in order to make others around you comfortable. If you are an opinionated child, if you are, even when it comes to the way that we are born in our identities in terms of like our sexual preference, or even when it comes to our religious preference as we are developing, and if it is not in alignment to, or if it is not in, if it doesn't conform to what is happening around us, then we are deemed the outcast. And then as a result, we are made to feel like something is wrong with us. And it's natural, it is human nature to internalize how people respond to you and begin to feel that way about yourself if you're not careful, which is why it's very important to, when you are capable and able, if you're lucky enough, as when you're young, if you're lucky enough you have parents and people around you who cultivate who you are and celebrate who you are and embrace who you are regardless, and don't impose their own expectations upon you. But if you're not lucky enough, and I'd argue that most of us have not been, that as you get older, it's really important to find a community of people who are similar to you and are appreciate exactly who you are, right? And so that is more often than not the remedy to all of this, is that you always want to find a community of people who appreciate and see the value in exactly who you are, so that you don't have to operate in a place of a trauma response by conforming, right? And even when we do find communities and support systems, all live in a large society, that when we step out of the spaces of safety, we still are going to experience people who don't understand and who don't get us, and there will still be a need to conform, but because you want to feel safe, right? But I think there's levels to how you do that. And I also believe that when you have a community and support system that has cultivated who you are and empowered and allowed you to feel good about who you are, you feel more confident about stepping out into other spaces where people are different than you and still operating in your comfortability in who you are unapologetically, right? That's ultimately the goal. And what I will say when it comes to thinking about whether you're someone who operates in a space of conformity or a space of being your full and complete self unapologetically, just begin to ask the question, what are some of my behaviors that I shift or change that are not who I am, but I do it anyway in order to be accepted. I also want to offer you food for thought as parents of children in general, but for the sake of this podcast, for parents of children on the spectrum, I want to offer you this guiding question to think about as well. What do you do or say to your child on a day to day basis that uh, is in alignment to wanting them to diminish a part of who they are in order to make you or others around you comfortable, right? Now, that does not mean that you don't teach your child to cooperate and in the larger sense of what it looks like to cooperate as it relates to learning, teaching your child to communicate and teaching your child to be independent. Cooperation is different than conformity in the sense that when we are asking our children to cooperate, and even when we are in positions where we need to cooperate, the benefit and the need for that is because we need to be able to learn. We need to be able to learn about who we are interconnected to other people around us, regardless. And there's a way to do that without changing who you are. So, cooperation simply means assessing the environment around you. How can I still be my authentic self, but regulate myself enough to honor what is happening around me and not negatively impact others around me? So, we know that for school children, yes, if you have a child who is hyperactive, they absolutely need to learn to sit and listen sometimes. Like, this is one way of learning. And you will have times when you can get up and run around, like it, because I know we understand that's fundamentally who you are, but there will be moments where you have to do the thing that is not comfortable for you. That doesn't mean that you shift who you are. It means that you adjust and adapt while holding on to your authentic self. And then there are parts of you, of who you are, that will be able to support your ability to cooperate in environments if you are, if you learn the balance of that. Additionally, and I probably will say this lastly, is that it's really important for us to differentiate between what it means to get along with others and enjoy life, but doing it in a way that's authentic to you, as opposed to doing it, as opposed to shifting who you fundamentally are in order for that to happen, right? So, understanding those nuances really boils down to asking yourself the basic fundamental question around what, if you have a tendency to conform, or do you have a tendency to rebel, right? That's a thing too. When it comes to raising your child who is on the autism spectrum, I think that it is essential to teach them, obviously, those fundamental traits that they'll need in order to thrive in the world, like learning how to get along with people, learning how to communicate with people, learning how to regulate whenever they're feeling anxious. Like, those are going to be fundamental. But then there are some things about themselves that it's not harming anyone, so that means that may not need to change over time. And for me, I give an example of my son. He is someone who is constantly moving around the house and is super active. And sometimes I do tell him to sit down, because that can, it's, you need to rest your body and your mind. But for the most part, I allow him space to do that because it's not hurting anybody. Another trait is that my son is not conversational. And so when others are speaking, trying to speak to him, sometimes he responds, sometimes he doesn't, but I don't force it, like, at all. And as his mom, I advocate for him in the sense that I'll let people know he's on the spectrum. He's not going to always respond to you. And I try to do it in a way where it's confident and direct so that it eliminates any awkward moments. But those are like two examples that come to mind. I don't I tr- The goal is to balance creating safe spaces for you and your child, and always creating an opportunity for your child to grow and learn and develop as it relates to, like, their independence, their communication, and their ability to engage with people. But outside of those realms, if it is not harming anyone, there really is no need to force your child to conform. Plenty of people who are actually autistic say that one of the things that has increased, like, their level of anxiety and mental health over the years as they become adults, was that they felt like they had to mask some of their behaviors that were rooted in their autism so that they wouldn't be judged. And if I don't do anything else as a parent, I want to make sure that I give my child the tools to manage his emotions and take care of himself and practice self-care in order to minimize any level of mental health concerns. And so one of the ways that self-care comes into place is by choosing to show up as your authentic self, right? But then a part of that for all of us in society is, in order for that to work effectively, a part of that requires for all of us to actively choose, number one, to not judge people for who they are or how they choose to show up in the world, and number two, to begin to unpack our own mindsets and beliefs about how people should behave in the world. Like, where does it come from? Like, what are we projected upon others in order for us to feel good or feel safe? What are we requiring of others that is a trauma response in order for us to feel good and feel safe? And like, ultimately, is that necessary? Like, those are things we need to begin to ask. It is natural for us to want to feel good and safe in the world, but the way that we go about doing it oftentimes can hurt others. And so that really is at the core of this entire conversation. I think the bottom line is that we need to think about how our response to trauma is continuing to impact us and impacting others around us. Okay, so I'm gonna leave it there. I hope that that was helpful for you all. I can get on a tangent and ramble, but hopefully that was super helpful. Leave me some feedback, and I would love to hear your thoughts on all of this. In the meantime, please continue to support. There are plenty of free resources on my website, Embracing Neurodiversity, for parents. I'm also offering some free coaching sessions as well for parents who have a child who has been newly diagnosed, and as a parent, if you're trying to think about how to unpack this and how to embrace it, and you're just not getting on this journey, one of the key ways to build your strength to embark on this journey is by having a support system. And I want to be able to provide that for parents who have shared experiences as mine as an autism parent myself. And so please feel free to reach out if you are looking for additional support. In the meantime, podcast is always available, and I hope that you all have a great week. Bye.